Once again, the mass media is pushing the state's agenda to disarm nonviolent people in the name of public safety. So, if you're finding that reasoning at all convincing, if you're finding the idea that the state having a monopoly on firearms, like they're the only people that have firearms, if you think that sounds like a good idea, like a possible solution, you're incorrect, and I'm going to try to explain exactly how you're incorrect in this short talk. So, one thing that is lost in all of the propaganda and just in the news stories, which are, of course, very emotionally charged, right? They're going to be appealing to emotion, appealing to pity, and talking about the tragedy of people being killed, which, of course, is a true tragedy. But by having you get in that emotional state, you're less likely to think critically, and you're less likely to question the so-called solution being offered. And that solution, as is always the case when coming from basically socialist, communist-minded rulers, governors, is to give the state more power and to make people more disempowered. So the basic ethics that you need to laser in on is that disarming nonviolent people is actually an abusive act. And the way you can recognize that, hopefully, is if you just think about two neighbors interacting with one another, and one neighbor goes over to the house of another and says, "Hey, I think it'd be safer if you didn't have any weapons. I think the whole community here, I think the whole neighborhood would be safer if you didn't have any weapons. So, yeah, I want you to turn in all your weapons." So that wouldn't be legitimate on an ethical level because it's putting the neighbor that's being disarmed in a vulnerable position, right? That neighbor is no longer going to be able to defend himself or his family adequately, right? If somebody breaks into his house with a gun and he doesn't have something of equal force to use defensively, he's going to be at a disadvantage and his family is going to be much more vulnerable. So putting someone in that position is abusive, right? To be aggressive towards someone when they haven't actually done anything aggressive themselves is unethical. So that's the gist of the ethics that it seems is just never talked about in the mainstream, because if it was talked about, it would clear up the supposed or seeming complication of this issue. It's not complicated at all. What's called gun control is just a euphemism. It's just it's deceptive language. What gun control means is state control of all the guns. Murdering someone has always been wrong. It's been illegal. You don't need new gun laws to make harming someone a crime, right? That's already been established. Thou shalt not kill, right? And it's understood that that's not acceptable. So you need to first of all recognize that whenever they're talking about gun control, they're not talking about, oh, we need to make a law that says it's not okay to hurt people, right? Like that's already a law. um, what they're talking about is restricting access to firearms by people that aren't actually hurting anybody. They say, oh, well, they have the potential. So this is where you need to recognize the gigantic double standard, which is actually a form of gaslighting, because they're saying, oh, you the people, regular people out there, the population, you are potentially dangerous with weapons. And so we, other people that just happen to be employed by the government, are the only ones that are, what's the word, worthy. We're the only ones morally upright enough and trustworthy enough to have all the weapons. So that deserves questioning, right? Because if that's not obviously false on its face to you, it's something certainly you should question. Why is it assumed that people working for a government are automatically more trustworthy than people that don't work for the government? What is it about being employed by the government, once you start getting a paycheck that happens to be funded by a form of extortion known as taxation? Why is it that that supposedly holy institution there, based on abuse actually, puts you in a higher status? What is it about that employment that automatically makes you more trustworthy? So it doesn't make sense just on a basic logical level, but also historically it doesn't hold up to scrutiny whatsoever, right? Because misuse of weaponry on huge, on the hugest and most hellish scales has been carried out by governments, right? So it doesn't make sense why you would think disarming nonviolent people and giving all the weapons to those that are actually consistently violent, why that would make sense. And you might think, well, my local police or sheriff, I think are trustworthy, but you have to understand that they are part of a chain of command, right? And as you go up the chain of command, it's safe to say that the trustworthiness generally decreases as you go up the pyramid. So they're dependent on and subservient to those of a higher rank on that chain of command. So when you give all of the weapons to the state, you're really giving them to whoever is at the top of the pyramid, who you don't even really know who they are. Gun control is evil in disguise. It's just a power grab, which is what those with a lot of power and are communist minded always seek to do. They want to gain even more control and power, which they invariably use to be more abusive. And the reason why it's definitely communist is, one, because it fits history of communism. You just see repeated examples throughout history where communist rulers disarm the people before they then become more totalitarian, tyrannical, i.e. abusive. Communist because it fits the definition of communism, which is a form of governance that is founded on the abolition of private property, meaning what used to be private property now becomes state property. So in the context of gun control, the private property of whatever weaponry you might have is now abolished, right? You're no longer allowed to have that. It's only state property. So it's a form of communism in that way. It's the form of abolishing what is rightful private property and saying, no, it just belongs to the state. Medical tyranny is another huge example of that in recent years, where they're actually taking over the private ownership of your own body and saying that it's actually owned by the state, because if you can't make your own medical decisions for yourself or for your children, and the state can, that's saying that the state actually is the new owner. You no longer have private ownership of your own body. It's now state property. So it's just abusive communism and all of this deceptive emotional manipulation of these tragedies, which the origin of these tragedies often are of, let's say, questionable, it's not as straightforward as it might, as they present it, A lot of times there's government involvement. There is such a thing as state-sponsored terrorism. That is a historical fact. State-sponsored terrorism has occurred in history. It's not just a theory. So that needs to be taken into consideration along with these basic ethics. But the reason, like I stated in a previous talk about why the Second Amendment is number one as far as rights are concerned, is because it really does protect all your other rights. If you allow abusive rulers to disarm a population, well then they're just invariably going to become even more abusive, because what can you do? You can't defend yourselves anymore. It's pretty basic, it's like, just think again of one neighbor and another. If one neighbor wanted to abuse another neighbor, the first thing he'd try and do is, the first thing he'd ensure is that the neighbor didn't have any weapons that he could use to defend himself, right? It's not complicated. People just don't see it as this clear cut because they don't see the state as a group of people to be wary of. They actually see them as their idols or gods. They see them as their protectors, and the ones, keeping society from falling into utter chaos and mayhem. But this neglects the basic fact that you can have security without involuntary so-called social contract agreements based on extortion. If you think your local sheriff is a good guy and, the people he works with too, well then you can support them. You can hire them. You can pay for their services, To think that giving over our autonomy to a giant government bureaucracy, which just does whatever it wants basically with your tax dollars, to think that that's the safer way to go, or to think that that's like the way to maintain social justice and harmony, doesn't actually make sense, and it doesn't hold up to any kind of historical analysis either. So I hope some of you found this helpful in clarifying why what's called gun control is really just evil in disguise. And the reason it's evil is because abuse is pure evil. Abuse is the opposite of love, and God's law is to offensively. So the devil pushes the opposite, which is abuse. So they're saying, hey, look, this act of abuse happens. So here's the solution. We get to be abusive towards you. No, that's not a valid solution. It really is that simple. If, if one person abuses another and then some other group of people say, oh, I know what the solution is to this act of violence, I get to be abusive towards everybody, right? You would say, that's ridiculous. That's crazy. That's not helping anything. You're just making matters worse, actually. You're just increasing the amount of abuse in the world. Again, if someone is doing something violent, defensive force is legitimate, and, it's always been considered criminal. It's always been considered immoral. No one's arguing that we should let people do violent things and not stop them. The problem is people don't recognize that disarming nonviolent people is actually an act of violence itself, and so therefore isn't a solution to violence. All right, thanks for listening.